The morning of December 18, 1944, outside the Belgian village of Krinkelt. A German anti-tank crew settled into position behind their 88mm PK-43. The gun was a monster, over 16 feet long, its barrel capable of hurling a 22-pound armor-piercing shell at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Frost clung to the metal like frozen lace. The crew's breath came in white clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter Ardennes wind. They had been awake since 3 in the morning, part of the massive German counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter commanded the gun. He was 26 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had destroyed 11 Soviet tanks at Kursk. His hands moved with the practiced confidence of a man who had done this hundreds of times before. To Richter and his crew, the 88 was not just a weapon. It was certainty itself, mathematical certainty, mechanical certainty, the kind of absolute reliability that allowed men to function under the crushing pressure of combat. In 2 years of fighting, Richter had never seen armor that could withstand a direct hit from his gun at combat range. Not the Soviet T-34, not the British Churchill, and certainly not the American Sherman, that rolling coffin the Germans mockingly called a Tommy Cooker because of how quickly it burst into flames when penetrated. Through the early morning fog, Richter spotted movement 300 meters down the forest road. A Sherman tank emerged from the tree line, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light. The fog swirled around its hull like gray smoke, but there was no mistaking what it was. Another American tank, another easy kill. Standard procedure. Richter's gunner, Gefreiter Hans Müller, already had the traverse wheel spinning, bringing the long barrel to bear on the target. The loader, moving with the fluid efficiency of countless repetitions, slammed an armor-piercing round into the breech with a metallic clang that echoed across the frozen ground. The entire sequence took 11 seconds. They had done this so many times that words were unnecessary. Just hand signals, head nods, and the mechanical choreography of men who had become extensions of their weapon. Müller centered the crosshairs on the Sherman's hull, just below the turret ring where American armor was thinnest. It was the textbook shot, the one that had worked every single time for 2 years, the one that turned Sherman crews into burning corpses before they even knew they'd been hit. Richter gave the command. Feuer! The 88 roared. The concussion was enormous. A physical punch of overpressure that rattled equipment and sent a shockwave across the frozen ground. The long barrel recoiled smoothly on its hydraulic system. Smoke and flame erupted from the muzzle. The shell crossed the distance in less than a third of a second, a blur of tungsten-cored steel traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. It bounced. The crew saw the bright spark of impact, the shell deflecting upward at a steep angle and disappearing into the gray sky. The distinctive whine of a ricochet carried across the battlefield. For a moment, no one spoke, no one moved. They just stared through their optics, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Müller blinked, certain he had misjudged the range or the angle. But the data was correct. 300 meters, near perpendicular to the target. A textbook shot. The kind of shot that should have punched through the Sherman's armor, detonated its ammunition, and turned the crew into red mist. The Sherman kept coming. It didn't slow down. It didn't stop. It didn't explode or burn or do any of the things that Shermans were supposed to do when hit by an 88mm shell. It just kept rolling forward, turret beginning to traverse toward the German position. Richter felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years of combat. Doubt. Cold, creeping doubt that started in his stomach and spread through his chest like ice water. But he pushed it down. Equipment failure. Bad ammunition. A defective shell. It had to be something like that. Knockmouths. Again. The loader was already moving, hands automatic despite the confusion screaming in his mind. Another shell. Another clang as it seated in the breech. Müller, his eye pressed to the sight, made a tiny adjustment. Dead center on the glacis plate this time. The thickest part of the Sherman's frontal armor, but still only supposed to be about 2 inches of steel. Nothing. Nothing that should stop an 88. Feuer. The gun roared again. The recoil. The smoke. the shell crossing the frozen air in a microsecond blur. This time they all watched the impact point with absolute focus, needing to understand what was happening. The shell struck the Sherman's glacis plate dead center, exactly where Miller had aimed. Again the spark. Again the deflection. The projectile that should have penetrated 4 inches of armor and turned the crew inside into fragments simply skipped off the hull like a stone across water. The Sherman's turret completed its traverse. The barrel pointed directly at the German position. What Klaus Richter and his crew did not know, could not have known, was that they were facing one of only 254 M4A3E2 assault tanks ever built. The Americans called it the Jumbo. Its frontal armor was not the 2 inches of a standard Sherman, nor even the 4 inches of the later models. In key areas, accounting for angle and applique plates, it approached 7 inches of hardened steel. The 80mm PK-43, the gun that had defined armored warfare on the Western Front, the weapon that had never failed them, had just met its match. The question was not whether Richter's crew would survive the next 30 seconds. The question was how many other German gunners would face this impossible. Sherman, before someone in intelligence, believed them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of WWII's most shocking tactical surprises, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. To understand the shock of that moment outside, Krinkelt, the pure disbelief that paralyzed Richter's crew for those critical seconds, you must first understand what the 88mm gun meant to the German Wehrmacht. It was not simply a weapon. It was a philosophy made steel, the physical manifestation of German technical superiority that had dominated 3 years of armored combat. The story of the 88 began not as an anti-tank weapon at all, but as the Flak 18, an anti-aircraft gun designed in the early 1930s. Its high muzzle velocity, necessary to reach bombers at altitude, gave it extraordinary penetrating power against ground targets. This discovery was made almost by accident during the Spanish Civil War, when German Condor Legion crews found they could destroy Republican tanks with devastating ease. The lesson was not lost on Wehrmacht planners. By 1940, the 88 had been adapted for dedicated anti-tank work. The PK-43, introduced in 1943, pushed performance even further. Its tungsten core ammunition could penetrate 6 inches of armor at 1,000 meters. At typical combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters, the distances where most tank battles actually occurred, it could defeat any Allied tank in service. British Churchills, with their thick infantry support armor designed to shrug off smaller anti-tank guns, were vulnerable. Soviet T-34s, praised for their revolutionary sloped armor design that was supposed to deflect shells, offered no protection against the 88's kinetic energy. And American Shermans? They might as well have been made of cardboard. The statistics were brutal and well documented. A 1944 U.S. Army study found that German 88mm guns accounted for roughly 30% of all Sherman losses in Normandy, despite representing less than 10% of German anti-tank weapons. The gun's effective range exceeded 2,000 meters, allowing German crews to engage Allied armor before American 75mm guns could respond effectively. The kill-to-loss ratio was devastating. For every 80mm anti-tank gun destroyed, German crews claimed an average of 7 Allied tanks. German crews knew these numbers intimately. More importantly, they felt them in their bones. The confidence that came from operating the 88 was absolute, almost religious. Training emphasized this superiority relentlessly. Gunnery instructors taught that the only challenge was hitting the target. Penetration was assumed, guaranteed, inevitable. Doctrine didn't even consider the possibility that Allied armor might survive a direct hit. After-action reports reinforced this assumption month after month, battle after battle. This psychological certainty extended far beyond the gun crews themselves. German infantry knew that if an 88 was in position, Allied armor could not advance. Commanders built entire defensive plans around the gun's capabilities, positioning them at key crossroads and along likely approach routes. The mere presence of an 88, even if camouflaged and silent, could halt an Allied advance simply through the threat it represented. Allied tankers feared the 88 with a dread that went beyond rational tactical assessment. It had acquired an almost supernatural reputation. American crews called them murder guns. British tankers referred to them as widowmakers. Soviet reports described positions defended by 88s as death zones to be avoided at all costs. The gun had earned these names through 3 years of utterly consistent performance. By late 1944, as Germany's strategic situation grew increasingly desperate, the 88 represented one of the few technological advantages the Wehrmacht still possessed. German tank production lagged far behind Allied output. American factories were building Shermans at a rate that German industry couldn't hope to match. The vaunted Panther and Tiger tanks, though formidable in combat, were complex, expensive, and prone to mechanical failure. Many spent more time awaiting spare parts than fighting, but the 88, whether mounted on a tank destroyer chassis or used as a towed anti-tank gun, remained reliable, effective, and psychologically dominant. It was the equalizer that allowed undermanned German units to hold positions against overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. It was the weapon that made German defensive doctrine workable even as the strategic situation collapsed, and it had never, ever failed to penetrate Allied armor at combat range. Not once in 3 years of continuous warfare across multiple fronts. That perfect record was more than a statistic. It was the foundation of German tactical confidence, the bedrock assumption on which defensive plans were built. That's why Klaus Richter's mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. The 88 didn't bounce. That wasn't something that happened. It was as impossible as gravity working backward or the sun rising in the west. The gun's reliability was one of the few certainties remaining in a war that had become increasingly uncertain. But the Sherman was still coming, and Richter's crew had maybe 15 seconds to figure out what to do next. This kind of tactical shock could break an army's confidence. If this story is blowing your mind, drop a like on this video and share it with anyone who appreciates military history that goes beyond the surface. While German gunners operated with supreme confidence, American tank crews in 1944 entered combat burdened by a very different psychology. They climbed into their M4 Sherman tanks knowing, with brutal statistical certainty, that they were outmatched. The Sherman was not designed to fight German heavy armor. It was designed to be produced in quantities that German industry could never hope to match. This was sound strategic doctrine at the highest levels, but it provided absolutely no comfort to the 20-year-old farm kid from Iowa who had to climb inside that steel box and drive toward German guns. The Sherman's frontal armor, in its most common variant, measured 2 inches on the hull and 3 inches on the turret. Later models, like the M4A1 with the 76mm gun, increased this to approximately 4 inches on the glacis plate when you accounted for its 47-degree slope, which effectively increased protection. These numbers were adequate against most German tanks and all German anti-tank guns of 1942 and early 1943. But by late 1944, those numbers were dangerously, lethally obsolete. A German 88mm PK-43 could penetrate 4 inches of armor at 1,500 meters, half a mile away. The Sherman's frontal protection could be defeated at ranges where American gunners couldn't effectively return fire. German Panther tanks, armed with a long-barreled 75mm gun, could destroy a Sherman from the front at 1,000 meters while remaining effectively immune to the Sherman's gun at the same range. The Tiger, with its 88mm KWK-36, represented an even more extreme mismatch. It could kill Shermans from ranges where the American tanks couldn't even see it clearly. American tactical doctrine acknowledged this reality with brutal honesty that bordered on fatalism. Training manuals instructed Sherman crews to avoid frontal engagements with German heavy armor whenever possible. The preferred tactic was to use numerical superiority, send multiple Shermans to attack from different angles, maneuver to flank positions where German side armor was thinnest, and rely on speed and numbers rather than protection. Official doctrine suggested that it took 5 Shermans to reliably destroy 1 Panther. Crews shortened this to a grim joke that made the rounds in every tank battalion. 4 Shermans to distract the Panther, 1 to get around behind. The nickname Ronson, or Tommy Cooker, reflected the Sherman's horrifying tendency to catch fire when penetrated. Early models stored ammunition in sponsons along the hull sides, directly in the path of penetrating shells. A hit would often ignite propellant charges, causing catastrophic internal fires that could turn the crew compartment into a blast furnace. The temperature inside could reach lethal levels in seconds. Crews had maybe 30 seconds to evacuate before they were cooked alive. Many didn't make it. Later variants moved ammunition storage below the turret basket and added water jackets for fire suppression. This wet stowage system significantly reduced the fire risk, but the reputation persisted. Once tankers started calling your vehicle a death trap or rolling coffin, that psychological damage was almost impossible to undo. Casualty. Statistics reinforce these fears with cold mathematical precision. A 1944 study by the 3rd Armored Division found that 62% of tank crew casualties occurred in the first 30 days of combat. New crews, unfamiliar with proper tactical employment and still learning to read the battlefield, suffered disproportionately. But even experienced crews faced grim odds in sustained combat. The average operational lifespan of a Sherman in heavy combat was measured in weeks, sometimes just days. Crews were rotated through replacement tanks with disturbing frequency. It was not uncommon for a veteran tanker to serve in 4 or 5 different Shermans during a single campaign. Not because they transferred, but because their previous tanks had been destroyed. Comment below your thoughts. If you were a Sherman crew in 1944, how would you cope with these odds? And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into WWII's untold stories. Yet, despite these terrible odds, Shermans kept coming. American industrial capacity was simply overwhelming. U.S. factories produced nearly 50,000 M4 variants during the war. German factories, working under constant Allied bombing and facing chronic shortages of raw materials, managed approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers in the same period. The Sherman's mechanical reliability, ease of maintenance, and logistical simplicity meant that American armored formations could sustain operations indefinitely. You could fix a broken Sherman with basic tools and commonly available parts. A broken Panther or Tiger might wait weeks for specialized components that had to come from Germany, if they came at all. German heavy tanks spent more time awaiting repair than engaging the enemy. This created a profound paradox in American armor doctrine. Strategically, the Sherman was winning the war through sheer numbers, reliability, and sustainability. American armored divisions could maintain tempo, keep pushing, stay mobile in ways that German formations simply couldn't match. Tactically, however, individual crews faced terrifying odds every single time they encountered German heavy weapons. The tankers who fought in Normandy, who pushed through the murderous hedgerows and engaged Panthers at point-blank range in narrow lanes where there was no room to maneuver, understood that their survival depended not on armor protection, but on speed, concealment, and the desperate hope that the next German gun would miss, or that they could get the first shot off, or that they'd face the older Panzer IVs instead of the nightmarish Panthers and Tigers. They climbed into their Shermans every morning knowing the statistics, knowing what happened to Shermans when 88s opened fire, knowing that their 2 inches of frontal armor was less protection than a promise and more like a psychological security blanket that didn't actually work. Into this environment, in the summer of 1944, arrived 254 tanks that broke every assumption about American armor. They were Shermans in name and silhouette, but their armor protection rivaled German heavy tanks. The designation was M4A3E2. The crews simply called them jumbos. And for reasons rooted in secrecy, limited production, and rushed deployment, German intelligence never learned they existed until it was far too late. The M4A3E2 assault tank emerged not from deliberate long-term planning, but from desperate necessity recognized in the spring of 1944. As Allied planners prepared for the invasion of Normandy, intelligence reports painted an increasingly concerning picture. German forces had fortified the French coast with extensive defensive works. Concrete bunkers, reinforced strongpoints, layered anti-tank obstacles, extensive minefields, and interlocking fields of fire that would turn beaches into killing grounds. Breaking through these defenses would require armor capable of leading infantry assaults directly into prepared positions while absorbing punishment that would destroy standard tanks. American infantry needed a battering ram, something that could take hits from anti-tank guns, shrug off Panzerfaust rounds, and keep moving forward while infantry followed in its wake. The problem reached the desk of Major General Gladian Barnes, chief of the Army Ordnance Department's Research and Development Service. His solution was elegantly simple, almost brutally pragmatic. Take the proven Sherman chassis and add as much armor as the suspension could physically bear. No radical redesign. No lengthy testing period that would delay production. Just raw additional steel welded onto existing hulls. The Fisher tank arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan received the contract in May 1944. Engineers calculated that the M4A3 chassis, with its Ford GAA V8 engine producing 500 horsepower, could support an additional 9 tons of armor without catastrophic mechanical failure. The suspension would be stressed to its limits, the engine would work harder, fuel consumption would increase dramatically, but it would work. The base hull armor was essentially doubled. The glacis plate received an additional 1.5 inches of face-hardened steel, bringing total thickness to approximately 5.5 inches at a 47-degree angle. When you accounted for the sloping and the effective thickness it created against direct fire, this translated to roughly 7 inches of protection. The weight penalty was severe. The jumbo's combat weight increased from 33 tons to 42 tons. That's a 27% increase, nearly 10 tons of additional mass that the engine, transmission, and suspension had to somehow manage. Top speed decreased from 30 miles per hour to approximately 22. The power-to-weight ratio, already marginal on standard Shermans, dropped to just 14 horsepower per ton. This made the jumbo sluggish in acceleration, poor at climbing steep grades, and heavy on fuel consumption. But none of this mattered if the armor worked. If those extra inches of steel could stop an 88 mm round, if they could keep crews alive, then the mobility penalties were acceptable. Speed wouldn't save you from a direct hit. Armor might. If this engineering solution is fascinating to you, make sure you're subscribed. We're going deep into how 254 tanks created psychological warfare on a massive scale. Production began in June 1944 and concluded by July. The limited run of 254 tanks reflected both the urgency of the project and its inherent limitations. Each jumbo required approximately 12 tons of additional steel at a time when every pound of armor plate was allocated to competing priorities: destroyer escorts, bomber armor, tank destroyer production, countless other weapons, systems all competing for the same limited resources. The decision was made to produce a small number of highly specialized assault tanks rather than marginally improve the protection of a much larger fleet. It was a calculated gamble. Would 254 near-invulnerable tanks make more difference than using that same steel to add an inch of armor to 2,000 standard Shermans? The initial 75mm M3 gun was retained, a decision that would prove intensely controversial among crews and would later drive field modifications. Ordnance officers argued that the jumbo's role was to absorb fire and create breaches in German defenses, not to engage enemy armor at long range. The shorter, lower-velocity 75mm had better, high-explosive performance for bunker busting, and was perfectly adequate for supporting infantry assaults, but this meant that jumbo crews possessed extraordinary protection while carrying a gun that was inadequate for fighting the heavy German tanks they would inevitably encounter. They could survive hits from Panthers and Tigers, but they couldn't reliably kill them from the front. It was like giving a boxer the world's best defensive armor but restricting him to fighting with one hand. The first jumbos reached Europe in late July 1944, weeks after the Normandy landings had already secured the beachheads. They were distributed in small numbers across multiple armored divisions rather than concentrated in dedicated units. The 2nd Armored Division received 30. The 3rd Armored Division received 34. The 4th Armored Division, which would later spearhead Patton's drive across France, received 22. This dispersal pattern meant that most American tankers never even saw a jumbo. Most German intelligence officers never captured one intact to study. Most importantly, there was no centralized doctrine for employing these tanks. Company commanders suddenly received vehicles with armor specifications that seemed almost fantastical. 7 inches. Frontal protection sounded like a typo, but received 0. Training on how to exploit this capability. Some innovative commanders used jumbos as spearheads for urban assaults, sending them straight up streets where their frontal armor could absorb fire from windows and rooftops. Others positioned them as mobile pillboxes in defensive positions, using them as anchors that couldn't be easily knocked out. A few enterprising commanders placed jumbos at point-and-column advances, trusting the armor to survive the first German ambush and reveal enemy positions without losing the lead tank. The crews themselves were standard Sherman tankers, not specially selected or given any additional training. They learned their tank's capabilities through trial and error, often under fire. The weight difference was immediately and painfully apparent. The jumbo accelerated slowly, struggled in mud that standard Shermans could handle, and consumed fuel at an alarming rate that logistics officers found deeply irritating. But in direct combat, when German anti-tank guns opened fire, the armor performed beyond expectations. Crews reported hits from German guns that would have destroyed standard Shermans, the kind of impacts that typically meant instant death, but which merely left dents and scorch marks on the jumbo's hull. Hits that should have penetrated, that should have ignited ammunition and killed everyone inside, just bounced. Word spread informally through the ranks, the way important information always does in armies. Certain Sherman tanks, identical in external silhouette to standard models, were nearly invulnerable from the front. If you saw one with extra thickness around the turret, if you noticed the additional armor plates, that was a jumbo. And jumbo crews came home alive at rates that standard Sherman crews could only dream about. But the information remained anecdotal, confined to American formations. German intelligence, already overwhelmed by the collapse of France, the need to track hundreds of Allied units, and the systematic degradation of their reconnaissance capabilities, never identified the jumbo as a distinct variant requiring special tactical consideration. That failure, that critical intelligence gap, was about to have consequences that German anti-tank crews couldn't possibly imagine. We're about to see how this intelligence failure turned into psychological warfare. Hit that like button and drop a comment about whether you'd heard of the jumbo before this video. The failure of German intelligence to identify the jumbo Sherman represents one of the war's most consequential oversights. It wasn't the result of incompetence or laziness. It was the natural consequence of a military intelligence apparatus that had been systematically degraded by 3 years of losses, strategic overextension, and the cumulative effects of Allied counterintelligence operations. By late 1944, German military intelligence, the Fremde Heer West, Foreign Armies West, operated under conditions approaching complete blindness. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been thoroughly compromised by Allied double agents and absorbed into the SS earlier that year after a series of catastrophic failures. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft, absolutely essential for gathering tactical intelligence on Allied movements and equipment, had been swept from the skies by overwhelming Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe could barely protect German cities from round-the-clock Allied bombing. Conducting systematic reconnaissance of Allied rear areas, where new equipment like the jumbo would first appear for training and deployment, was essentially impossible. German reconnaissance pilots who ventured over Allied-held territory had life expectancies measured in missions, not months. Human intelligence networks in England and France had been systematically dismantled. The stunning success of Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan for D-Day that convinced German High Command the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, demonstrated just how thoroughly German intelligence had been penetrated and manipulated. Officers who had once confidently assessed Allied capabilities now operated on fragments, rumors, outdated information, and sometimes deliberate disinformation fed to them by Allied intelligence services. They knew the Americans were producing tanks in vast quantities. The numbers were staggering and impossible to hide. They knew the British were introducing new variants with improved guns. But the critical details, the specifications that would allow tactical adaptation to new threats, remained frustratingly elusive. They were fighting blind, making decisions based on assumptions that were increasingly divorced from battlefield reality. The Jumbo's limited production numbers worked powerfully in favor of maintaining secrecy. 254 tanks represented less than 0.5% of total Sherman production, when distributed across multiple divisions on a front that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, a distance of over 400 miles. They appeared with such rarity that initial sightings were dismissed as anomalies or observer error. Think about it from a German intelligence officer's perspective. You receive a report from an anti-tank crew claiming that an 88mm shell bounced off a Sherman. What's more likely, that the Americans have secretly developed and deployed a Sherman variant with armor thick enough to stop an 88, or that the crew missed the target, that they hit at a bad angle, that the ammunition was defective, that they're making excuses for poor gunnery. The 88's perfect record for 3 years meant that reports of rounds bouncing were more likely to result in the gunner being accused of incompetence than in intelligence reassessing American tank capabilities. The weapon's reliability had become an article of faith, and challenging that faith required extraordinary evidence. This intelligence failure had devastating consequences on the battlefield. If you're appreciating this deep dive, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment about the biggest intelligence failure you've learned about. Moreover, the Jumbo's external appearance closely matched standard Shermans to a degree that made visual identification nearly impossible under combat conditions. Unlike the British Churchill or the Soviet IS-2, which were visually distinct heavy tanks with completely different silhouettes, the Jumbo retained the familiar Sherman profile. At typical combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters, often through smoke, vegetation, fog, or the general chaos of battle, German gunners had mere seconds to identify targets. The training and doctrine that had served them brilliantly for 3 years now betrayed them. Sherman equals thin armor equals easy kill. That equation had been proven thousands of times. It was muscle memory, trained reflex, the kind of pattern recognition that allowed crews to function effectively under enormous stress. Questioning it required cognitive flexibility that was almost impossible to maintain in the middle of combat. The few Jumbos that were knocked out and subsequently examined by German technical intelligence teams provided misleading data. If a Jumbo was destroyed by a hit to the side or rear, where armor remained relatively thin at 3 inches and 1.5 inches respectively, examiners would note essentially standard Sherman construction. The dramatically thickened frontal armor would be missed because the damage was elsewhere. If a Jumbo was disabled by mechanical failure or abandoned by its crew, German stripping teams prioritized recovering weapons, optics, radio equipment, and other immediately useful items over carefully measuring armor thickness. Time was always limited. Allied counterattacks or artillery fire could arrive at any moment. Spending precious minutes with measuring tools to document armor. Specifications wasn't a priority when you could grab a working radio or optical sight. Incremental nature of the armor increase also worked against detection. German intelligence knew that American tank production involved continuous minor improvements. Armor thickness varied slightly between production batches. Welding techniques improved. Armor quality got marginally better, so if field measurements showed variation in Sherman armor thickness, that didn't necessarily reveal a systematic enhancement program. It could just be normal production variance. German tactical doctrine in late 1944 compounded the identification problem. Wehrmacht defensive tactics had evolved to emphasize mobility, ambush from concealment, and rapid withdrawal rather than static defensive positions. Anti-tank guns were increasingly positioned to engage flanks and rears, hitting enemy armor from the sides where protection was weakest, rather than fighting frontal, duels where German guns would be exposed to return fire. When a jumbo did appear frontally and survive hits that should have been kills, German crews operating under this doctrine would more likely assume they had misjudged the firing angle or that atmospheric conditions had affected trajectory. Questioning the fundamental assumption that all Shermans had thin armor required a level of tactical analysis that was nearly impossible in the heat of combat, the absence of captured. Technical documents proved absolutely critical. Allied security classifications kept jumbo specifications tightly controlled at the secret level. Unlike standard Shermans, whose technical manuals had been captured throughout 1943 and 1944, allowing German intelligence to know exact armor thicknesses, weak points, ammunition storage locations. No jumbo manual fell into German hands during the critical deployment period. American crews were explicitly instructed to destroy all documentation if capture seemed imminent. Standard procedure was to use thermite grenades to melt technical manuals into illegible slag. The few jumbos that were lost intact were typically recovered by American forces before German intelligence teams could conduct thorough examinations. American doctrine prioritized recovering disabled tanks quickly, both to deny intelligence to the enemy and to salvage valuable equipment. Comment below. Have you ever heard of the Jumbo Sherman before this video? The secrecy was so effective that many WWII enthusiasts don't know it existed. Perhaps, most significantly, the timing of the Jumbo's deployment coincided with Germany's broader strategic collapse, a period when intelligence resources were completely overwhelmed. In the summer and fall of 1944, German forces were reeling from catastrophic losses on multiple fronts. Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front had destroyed Army Group Center. An entire army group of over 300,000 men essentially ceased to exist. The Falaise Pocket in France trapped and destroyed much of Germany's armored reserve in the west. Romania's defection cost Germany its primary source of petroleum. Intelligence resources were focused on existential threats to Germany's survival. Soviet offensives that might reach Berlin before winter, Allied plans for crossing the Rhine, the anticipated invasion of Germany proper, a slightly better armored Sherman variant, appearing in small numbers on the Western Front, simply didn't register as a priority concern compared to these strategic catastrophes. German intelligence summaries from September through November 1944 make no mention of enhanced Sherman armor, none. Tactical bulletins warned of improved Allied anti-tank weapons. The 76mm gun was finally being recognized as a legitimate threat and repeatedly emphasized Allied air superiority. But they continued to assess American tanks as vulnerable to German anti-tank guns at standard combat ranges. This assessment was reflected in tactical planning documents, training materials, and field manuals. The 80mm capabilities against Allied armor were treated as a known constant, not as a variable requiring reassessment. When the Battle of the Bulge was planned in November and December 1944, German commanders confidently expected their anti-tank guns to stop American armor as they always had. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption had become. The full psychological impact of the Jumbo Sherman crystallized during the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, when German tactical assumptions collided violently with American armor that refused to behave according to doctrine. The engagement outside Krinkelt that Klaus Richter's crew experienced was not an isolated incident. It was repeated across the entire Ardennes front, from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, as 88 crews faced a bewildering new reality that shattered 3 years of certainty. On the morning of December 17, 1944, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division encountered jumbos from Company B, 33rd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division near the Belgian town of Buchenbach. The tactical situation favored the Germans overwhelmingly. They had 5 Tiger tanks and multiple PK-43 anti-tank guns positioned in carefully prepared ambush positions. The terrain was perfect for defense, open fields with minimal cover, forcing Allied armor to advance along predictable routes where German guns had clear fields of fire exceeding 1,000 meters. 3 jumbos led the American column. Under standard doctrine, advancing into this kind of position would have been suicidal. The Tigers and anti-tank guns could engage at ranges where American return fire would be ineffective. German gunners could pick off Shermans methodically, one by one, before the American formation could even close to effective range. But the jumbo commanders, having learned their tanks' capabilities through previous engagements, learned that the armor actually worked, that they could take hits and survive, advanced with a confidence that seemed insane to watching German crews. The German guns opened fire at 800 meters. The first Tiger's 80-meter round struck the lead jumbo's glacis plate at a slight angle. The impact was tremendous. The shell penetrated the outer applique layer, creating a flash of sparks and metal fragments. But it failed to breach the base armor beneath. The impact sent a shockwave through the crew compartment that stunned the driver and made the entire tank ring like a bell, but the vehicle continued forward. No penetration, no fire. No catastrophic ammunition detonation. Just a deep scar in the armor and a crew that was bruised but alive and fighting. The Tiger crew, trained and experienced and utterly certain of their weapons' capabilities, stared in confusion at the Sherman that was supposed to be burning. They fired again, a textbook follow-up shot. The second round hit the jumbo's turret front. 7 inches of solid cast steel. Again, no penetration. The sound inside the jumbo was described by the gunner as like being inside a bell when it struck. Deafening. Disorienting, but not lethal. If this tactical revolution is fascinating you, make sure to like this video and share it with anyone who thinks they know everything about WWII armor. The jumbo's gunner, now fully oriented on the Tiger's muzzle flash, returned fire with his 75mm gun. The round was inadequate for frontal penetration of a Tiger's armor, everyone knew that, but it struck the German tank's gun mantlet with sufficient force to jam the traverse mechanism. The Tiger, effectively mission-killed with its main gun unable to aim, was forced to withdraw from the battle. A Tiger defeated not by being destroyed but by being damaged by a Sherman. The psychological impact on the German crew was profound. The remaining German armor, watching a Sherman absorb multiple 88mm hits and not only survive but continue fighting and scoring return hits, hesitated. That split-second hesitation, that moment of doubt that broke their trained response pattern, cost them initiative. The engagement devolved into a chaotic close-range fight as American infantry and additional Shermans, both standard and jumbo variants, pushed aggressively into the German position. By noon, the German force had withdrawn, having destroyed 2 standard Shermans but having completely failed to stop the armored column's advance. The 3 jumbos that led the assault bore multiple impact marks on their hulls and turrets, dents, scars, scorch marks from shells that hit with tremendous force. But not one had been penetrated from the front. Not one crew member had been killed. The jumbos had done exactly what they were designed to do: absorb fire that should have been lethal and keep fighting. A similar pattern repeated near Bastogne on December 20th, 1944. A single jumbo from the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Staff Sergeant William McVeigh, held a critical crossroads against repeated German attacks. The position was vital. It controlled the only paved road suitable for heavy vehicles in that sector, and losing it would allow German armor to bypass American defensive positions. McVeigh's jumbo was positioned hull down behind a slight rise, its thick frontal armor facing the most likely German approach route. Over 6 hours, that single tank absorbed 17 anti-tank rounds from German PaK-40s and PaK-43s. 17 hits. 17 impacts that would have destroyed any standard Sherman. 17 shells that bounced, deflected, or failed to penetrate. German forces, watching their rounds have no effect, became convinced they were facing a fixed fortification rather than a mobile tank. Some reports from captured German officers mentioned encountering a concrete bunker at that crossroads. They literally could not conceive that a Sherman tank could withstand that much punishment. Eventually, rather than continue expending precious ammunition uselessly, German forces bypassed the position entirely and sought alternate routes. McVeigh and his crew held that crossroads for the entire day, denying German armor a critical avenue of advance during the most dangerous phase of the Battle of the Bulge. When American reinforcements finally arrived that evening, they found McVeigh's jumbo still operational, its armor bearing the scars of 17 hits, but its crew unharmed and its guns still capable of fighting. These engagements created ripples of confusion through German formations that went far beyond the tactical impacts. After-action reports from the 6th Panzer Army, obtained from captured documents after the war, reveal growing uncertainty about American armor capabilities. One report from late December stated, "Enemy tank variants observed with improved frontal protection. 88mm penetration unreliable at ranges below 500 meters. Recommend targeting tracks and flanks exclusively." This was psychological warfare at its finest, and it happened by accident. Subscribe to see more untold stories of technological surprise in warfare. The language in that report is extraordinary. German tactical doctrine had never described 80mm penetration as unreliable. The weapon's effectiveness had been assumed, proven, taken for granted as one of the fundamental constants of armored warfare. The recommendation to target tracks and flanks represented a fundamental shift in tactical thinking, an implicit admission that frontal engagement was no longer guaranteed to succeed. For American crews, the jumbo provided not just physical protection, but psychological liberation. Tankers who had spent months accepting that their survival depended primarily on luck and maneuver suddenly possessed armor that could stand and fight. This confidence translated directly into tactical aggression. Jumbos were pushed forward into positions where standard Shermans would have been immediately withdrawn. They served as rallying points for infantry assaults, as mobile cover for advancing troops, and as psychological weapons whose mere presence altered German tactical calculations. One American tank commander, interviewed decades after the war, described the experience. "In a regular Sherman, you were always thinking about escape routes. Where can I go if I get hit? How do I bail out fast? In a jumbo, you could actually think about fighting. You could focus on killing the enemy instead of just trying not to die." That mental shift was as important as the armor itself. Yet the jumbo's limitations remained stark and frustrating. Side armor, though improved to 3 inches, remained vulnerable to German 75mm and 88mm guns at typical combat ranges. Hits to the sides could still result in catastrophic penetration, ammunition fires, crew casualties. Rear armor at just 1.5 inches could be penetrated by even lighter anti-tank weapons. The German Panzerfaust hollow charge weapon could destroy a jumbo from behind just as easily as a standard Sherman. The reduced mobility made jumbos vulnerable to flanking maneuvers and difficult to extract if terrain became unfavorable, or if they needed to retreat. The jumbo's top speed of 22 miles per hour meant that in fluid combat situations, faster German tanks could potentially maneuver around them. More critically, the 75mm gun meant that jumbos couldn't reliably engage German heavy armor frontally. A jumbo facing a Panther or Tiger in open terrain possessed armor superiority but firepower inferiority. The result was a strange standoff. The jumbo could survive hits from the German tank but couldn't kill it from the front. The German tank could potentially kill the jumbo with a lucky side or turret shot, but couldn't penetrate it frontally. The engagement became a tactical chess match. Could the jumbo close to point-blank range where the 75mm might find weak spots in German armor? Could it force the German tank to maneuver and expose its thinner side armor? Or would the superior German gun eventually land a shot that negated the jumbo's protection? The answer depended on terrain, crew skill, tactical situation, and often pure chance. But the fact that such engagements became tactical puzzles rather than certain American losses represented a revolutionary shift. For 3 years, American armor doctrine had simply accepted inferiority in individual tank versus tank combat. The jumbo, in limited numbers and with significant compromises, challenged that assumption. This firepower limitation drove urgent field modifications beginning in January 1945. Some jumbos received 76mm guns scavenged from destroyed standard Shermans. The conversion was completely unofficial, performed by maintenance battalions using whatever resources they could improvise, often working through the night to complete the modifications before the unit moved out. The longer, higher-velocity 76mm gave jumbos a fighting chance against German heavy armor at ranges where their superior frontal protection could be exploited. The 76mm could penetrate Panther armor at 500 meters from the front, not reliably, but possible with good shot placement. Against Tigers, the matchup remained difficult, but no longer completely hopeless. These field modifications showed American ingenuity at work. Comment below if you think the jumbo should have been produced with the 76mm from the start. Crews praised the results enthusiastically. A jumbo with a 76mm gun could fight Panthers on nearly equal terms, possessing comparable armor protection and adequate firepower. One crew commander called it the tank we should have had from the beginning. Armor good enough to survive German hits, firepower good enough to kill German tanks, mobility adequate for most tactical situations. Approximately 40 to 50 jumbos received this upgrade, though exact numbers remain uncertain due to the informal nature of the modifications. These hybrid jumbos represented what American armor doctrine had desperately needed since Normandy, a tank that could both survive and kill in direct combat with German heavies. Not a specialized tank destroyer, not a light tank relying on speed, not a standard Sherman relying on numbers, but an actual heavy tank that could stand and fight. Yet even as these modifications proceeded, the strategic context was shifting rapidly. By February 1945, German resistance in the West was collapsing under overwhelming pressure. The failure of the Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. Fuel shortages immobilized even undamaged German tanks. Lack of gasoline killed more German armor than American guns. Allied air superiority meant that German forces could barely move during daylight hours without being attacked from the air. The tactical problem that the jumbo had been designed to solve, breaking through prepared German defenses, was increasingly being solved instead by overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority. American forces could simply bypass strongpoints, knowing that cut-off German units would eventually run out of supplies and surrender. The jumbo Sherman's combat record, through the winter of 1944-45 and into the final months of the war, revealed both its extraordinary strengths and its inherent limitations. As American armored divisions compiled after-action reports, they attempted to quantify what crews had experienced viscerally on the battlefield. Casualty statistics told a striking and unambiguous story. Standard M4 Shermans operating in heavy combat during the Battle of the Bulge suffered loss rates approaching 40% in some battalions. That's an almost unbearable number. 2 out of every 5 tanks destroyed, their crews killed or wounded. Jumbos operating in identical conditions, often leading the same attacks and facing the same German weapons, experienced loss rates below 15%. That difference, 40% versus 15%, represented hundreds of American lives saved. When jumbos were knocked out, post-battle analysis consistently showed hits to sides, rear, or catastrophic mechanical failure rather than frontal penetration. The frontal armor was working exactly as designed. It was keeping crews alive. These statistics represent real lives saved, real families that didn't receive the terrible telegram. If this story matters to you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into WWII's forgotten innovations. But these numbers concealed tactical complexity. The jumbo's limited firepower meant it couldn't decisively engage German heavy armor in open combat. In engagements where jumbos faced Panthers or Tigers, the typical outcome was stalemate or withdrawal rather than American victory. The jumbo could survive the encounter, allowing its crew to live and fight. Another day, but it couldn't kill the German tank that had failed to kill it. This created frustration among crews who possessed extraordinary protection but inadequate offensive capability. They could take a hit and survive, but they couldn't necessarily win the fight. As one jumbo commander wrote in a letter home, "We're like a boxer with the best armor in the world, but fighting with one hand tied behind our back." The jumbo's psychological impact, however, persisted beyond its direct tactical utility. German gunners who had encountered heavily armored Shermans carried that experience into subsequent engagements. The absolute confidence that had characterized 80mm crews throughout 1943 and 1944, the certainty that their weapon would penetrate whatever they hit, was replaced by caution, uncertainty, and doubt. Intelligence briefings in February and March 1945 finally acknowledged the existence of heavily armored Sherman variants. But by then, the warnings came far too late to influence German tactical doctrine in any meaningful way. German industry had lost the capacity to respond. Factories were rubble, transportation networks were destroyed, raw materials were unobtainable. Even if German engineers had developed improved anti-tank weapons, there was no way to produce and distribute them to frontline units. For American tankers more broadly, even those who never crewed a jumbo, its existence provided something psychologically valuable, proof that American industry could produce armor equal to German standards when required. The narrative that American tanks were inherently inferior. The crews had to accept vulnerability as the price of mobility and reliability, was definitively shattered. You could build a Sherman that could stand up to German heavy tanks. It had been done. Only 254 existed, but that was enough to prove the concept. American tankers didn't have to die in thin-skinned death traps because that was the only option. They died in thin-skinned Shermans because strategic priorities emphasized quantity and reliability over protection. That distinction mattered psychologically, even if it didn't change the tactical reality for most crews. The jumbo influenced post-war American armor doctrine significantly. The tension between protection, firepower, and mobility that the jumbo embodied became absolutely central to American tank design philosophy. The recognition that crews needed protection sufficient to survive the opening moments of engagement, even at substantial cost to speed or operational range, shaped development of the M46, M47, M48, and ultimately the M60, patent tanks that dominated American armored forces through the 1950s and 1960s, but perhaps the jumbo's most significant legacy was symbolic rather than tactical. It represented American industrial flexibility, the capacity to identify a battlefield problem, develop a solution, and field it in quantity sufficient to matter within months rather than years. The fact that only 254 were built might seem insignificant against total Sherman production exceeding 49,000. But those 254 tanks appeared exactly when needed, performed exactly as required, and survived at rates that saved hundreds of American lives. We're approaching the end of this story, but the lessons remain relevant today. Subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives into military history that matters. The crews who fought in jumbos carried their experiences into peacetime. Veterans' accounts consistently emphasized the confidence that came from knowing their armor could protect them, the aggression it enabled in combat, and the profound gratitude they felt toward the engineers and workers who had built their tanks. For men who had previously accepted that survival was largely random chance, the jumbo provided something invaluable, a measure of control over their own fate, the ability to stand and fight rather than simply hope to avoid being hit. Staff Sergeant William McVeigh, who held that crossroads near Bastogne for 6 hours while his jumbo absorbed 17 hits, returned to Pennsylvania after the war. He worked as a machinist for 37 years, raised 4 children, and rarely spoke of his combat experience. When he did, in interviews conducted in the 1980s, he focused not on heroism or bravery, but on relief, the profound, overwhelming gratitude he felt for armor that had protected him when protection had seemed impossible. His story was repeated hundreds of times by jumbo veterans. They had survived not through luck or exceptional skill, but through engineering and industrial capacity. Their survival had been earned through American steel rather than random chance. This distinction, subtle but psychologically significant, affected how jumbo veterans processed their wartime experiences differently than many other tankers. The German crews who faced jumbos and survived carried different memories into peacetime. The shock of watching rounds bounce, the moment when doctrine failed and training proved inadequate, remained traumatic decades later. Klaus Richter, the Oberfeldwebel whose crew we met at the beginning outside Krinkelt, spent years after the war questioning his own competence. Had he somehow failed? Had his crew made a mistake? Were their weapons defective? Only decades later, when military historians revealed the jumbo's specifications and explained its limited production and deployment, did veterans like Richter understand that their weapons had not failed through defect or incompetence. They had simply encountered armor beyond their guns' capacity to penetrate. This revelation brought its own psychological complexity, relief that they had not failed personally, mixed with bitterness at the intelligence failure that had left them completely unprepared for what they would face. The jumbo's place in historical memory evolved over decades. Immediately post-war, it was overshadowed by the arrival of the M26 Pershing heavy tank and the broader narrative of American armor development. Military histories published in the 1950s barely mentioned the jumbo, focusing instead on the mass-produced standard Sherman and the dramatic but extremely limited Pershing deployments. The jumbo seemed like a footnote, an interesting variant that appeared too late and in too few numbers to matter strategically. This assessment shifted substantially in the 1970s and 1980s as historians gained access to German documents and conducted extensive interviews with veterans from both sides. The cumulative weight of accounts describing jumbos surviving hits that should have been instantly fatal, the tactical adaptations their presence forced, and the psychological impact they created led to historical reassessment. The jumbo emerged as a fascinating case study in how small numbers of superior equipment, properly employed and benefiting from surprise, could achieve effects completely disproportionate to their numerical quantity. Final thoughts. If this story changed how you think about WWII, armor warfare, please share this video. These forgotten stories deserve to be told. And subscribe for more deep dives that go beyond the surface of military history. Modern armor historians recognize the jumbo as a transitional design, a bridge between the mass-produced medium tank philosophy that dominated American doctrine through 1944 and the heavy tank doctrine that would emerge during the Cold War. Its compromises, trading mobility for protection while retaining inadequate firepower, illustrated the fundamental difficulty of balancing the 3 core characteristics of tank design. But its success in the specific role for which it was designed, absorbing fire and leading assaults, validated the concept of specialized variants within a common chassis family. The jumbo also serves as a reminder that technological surprise, even on a remarkably small scale, can create strategic psychological effects. 254 tanks could not change the war's outcome. The strategic situation was already decided by industrial capacity, logistics, and Allied numerical superiority. But they could change how individual battles unfolded, how crews fought and survived, and how many men made it home alive to their families. In the calculus of war, where individual lives often disappear into statistical aggregates and impersonal casualty figures, the jumbo represents something profoundly important: the recognition that protecting soldiers, even at the cost of other performance characteristics, was worth the industrial investment. that American lives had value sufficient to justify using scarce steel and production capacity to build tanks that would save them. Back outside Krinkelt on that December morning in 1944, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter watched the impossible Sherman's turret traverse toward his position. His crew was already preparing to displace, to relocate the gun and try again from a different angle with different tactics. The 80mm gun that had never failed them had just failed twice. The doctrine that had sustained them for 3 years had shattered in 30 seconds of impossible reality. The war would continue for 5 more months of bitter fighting, but in that moment the certainty was gone. They had encountered something new, something their training had not prepared them for, something German intelligence had never warned them about. They had encountered 7 inches of American steel forged in Michigan, and they had learned far too late that the age of the 88's absolute dominance was ending. The jumbo had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had survived. And in surviving, it had revealed a new truth about the war, that American industry, when focused and made urgent by necessity, could produce armor equal to Germany's best. Not in overwhelming numbers, not soon enough to fundamentally change the war's strategic outcome, but enough to matter tremendously to the men who climbed inside those tanks and came home alive to the families who loved them. That was the jumbo Sherman's legacy. Not the tank that won the war, but the tank that proved American armor could stand and fight. That protection was possible. That industrial capacity, rapidly applied to urgent problems, could save lives even in war's final, most desperate months. Tanks. Approximately 1,270 American tankers, and a survival rate that meant hundreds of fathers came home to their children, hundreds of husbands to their wives, hundreds of sons to their mothers. In the end, perhaps that's the only statistic that truly matters. Thank you for watching. If you want more detailed historical breakdowns of forgotten WWII innovations, check out our other videos. And please subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered.